interesting. My copy of the book, which was lying right in front of me until this morning, has suddenly disappeared. Which means, I will have to remember what was in the book, and it also sort of absolves me of having to ask intelligent questions. So I can actually ask dumb questions and make very, very ignorant comments in the middle of all this. And so let's get started. Welcome all of you. Those of you who are new to Takshashila, most welcome. This is an independent establishment of thinking and education. It's an independent school of public policy and a think tank. We engage ourselves in various pursuits: national security, public economics, technology and politics. We teach people public policy, intelligent people, smart people who are working adults in various walks of life. We have spent the last decade on Zoom, GoToWebinar, and WebEx. So it's very interesting to see the rest of the world join us on this online way of engagement. We are extremely happy to be able to launch our first book online, although in a situation where I myself don't have a copy of that book, which is also a first probably in this. So what I'll do today is I won't spend too much time formally introducing the two authors. In an online kind of a setup, your Google is your friend. You'll be easily able to find out everything about them, their deeds and their misdeeds, their fame and their notoriety fairly easily. So what I'll do is I'll just preface it with a few words of personal introduction, and before I ask the authors to come up and do interesting things. Hema and Ashok are a wonderful couple with their hearts and minds in the right place. And the snoring sound that you get is actually my dog who's on the side here. I assure you, it's not me. So if there are loud snoring sounds, that's him. There's evidence. Okay, that's him.
Lovely.
So he's the guy who's snoring, not me. Okay. So anyway, Hema and Ashok are a wonderful couple. Heart and mind in the right place. Are in a way an example of how Bangalore evolved. From they worked in an industry which is not quite IT, but highly in the technological space. Part of Bangalore's journey from being, an interesting technological town in India to a global technological, hub and a cosmopolitan hub. Hema and Ashok have been involved in many social activities after they finished their first innings at Conzerv. And Hema is an advisor and a donor to the Takshashila institution as well. And we've really benefited from the management advice which she has given us. And as a non-profit, it's always great to learn from people who've run businesses, because it gives you the market discipline and the edge to learn how to use funds and resources in the most efficient way. Ashish, is this guy who's from the arts scene. If you draw a XY axis, I'm on the X axis on the technological end, and Ashish is on the Y axis with arts, culture, and everything, public radio, theater, and writing. A man of many accomplishments, and an able partner for Hema in writing the book. So, for those of you who are coming in to this conversation, this is an unusual book that we're discussing at Takshashila. Not because Hema is a friend and an advisor, but because we believe that the book has a very important story. And when I was talking to Hema when she was writing the book, I said the book is important because it shows to the world that you can succeed in business when you take an ethical, thoughtful, sensitive path. There is a lot of cynicism out there to say that, if you have to run a successful business, you have got to bribe people, you've got to handle people, your HR in a particularly nasty way, you've got to be Machiavellian about running your business, and so on. But here's this business which is run exactly the opposite, right? With high levels of values, personal values, with strong ethical foundations, and technologically very innovative, and conscious of its intellectual property rights and management. So it's a very interesting example of a corporation which has risen out of Bangalore ecosystem. And for whether in public policy or in a business school, whether in media, I think it's very important to look at this book and look at the journey of the authors in this book and see what lessons it has for us, depending on, doesn't matter which field that we come in from. A quick, entree into the book. It's part autobiography, part management book, part consulting workbook, right? So, it's also a field manual for you to do things. And Hema, if you talk to her later, she'll share with you some of the frameworks she's invented as a result of her journey as a manager, which are an outcome of the book, which are actually tools to help individuals and organizations to succeed in business and in their enterprise. Okay, so that's as much as the book is. I want to bring the two authors on screen. If you have a gallery view, you could do that, but if you're not, that's fine also. So let me just bring Hema in first. Hema, welcome to your own book launch. And what would how would you characterize your journey writing this book? Okay, maybe even before that, why don't you just start by telling why did you write the book? I mean, what made you could have lived a happy life on your, doing your own things. Why did you put yourself through this grind of having to write a book, publish it, and then appear on shows like this one where we're discussing why you wrote the book?
Yeah. So before I jump into answering that question, Nitin, I think I'll just talk a little bit about myself to add to what you've already said. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining this very unusual launch of Liftoff. I do realize that you could have been on one of a dozen different webinars, as I found from some people who said the reason they haven't RSVP'd is that they've already logged into other webinars this evening. So I want to thank you for choosing us. And I want to thank Nitin, Soumya, and the whole team at Takshashila for pressing on regardless of COVID-19 and for making this launch happen. When things started going south, so soon after we had made very excited plans with Amazon and Westland to do a physical event, we had all thought we'd co-host it. And everything went, down the chute. I had written off having any kind of launch. So to me, this is a really, really special treat. So thank you very much. The only thing I have to get used to is to make eye contact, not with all of you, but with that green light LED on my laptop. But hey, that's just one more new thing that I'm learning to live with. So a little bit about myself. I'm Delhi born, Dharwad schooled, and I've been a resident of Bangalore since 1987. And when I was 32, and our first child, Raghav, was just over a year old, he was 15 months old, my life changed forever. And I got a chance to turn around the family business that Ashok, who's on this call, and his dad, Vasant Rao, had set up. And the business that they set up made some pretty radical products for the time. It sounds very boring, but they were pretty rad. They were digital energy meters and electronic voltage stabilizers. And Vasant Rao was a great designer. He was an engineer and a visionary. Sadly, we just lost him 2 weeks ago. So it's been a fairly tough time dealing with that in this lockdown. And he was very clear when we set up the business that we would only design, stick to knitting, design and manufacture the products and leave the sales and marketing to a new company that his nephews had set up. And they were given exclusive or sole selling and branding rights. So this arrangement did very well for a couple of years. And then when our products started doing really well in the markets and beat competitor products hollow, this little marketing company came to us and said, hey, you know what? We've built a really great brand. The market knows us now. So we are offering to acquire your little company. And if you don't like that thought, and if that doesn't sound very good, well, you can always end this agreement. We'll terminate it and we'll compete with you. So we as a family decided that we didn't want to be acquired because we had the intellectual property and the designs in all the products. And so in short order, the agreement was terminated and we found ourselves with bills to pay, wage bills of workmen, bank loans for a term loan we had taken to put up a factory. We didn't have a marketing and sales team. We had no brand that was known to the customer. And overnight, our marketing agent became our competitor. Along came a guardian angel, which was India's first private venture capital firm, Indus Venture, which was set up by T. Thomas. It was called TT. He was the former chairman of Hindustan Lever, and he found us through the marketing agency that had, recently dumped us. So he visited our new factory. He met Ashok and his dad and liked what he saw in the designs and in the integrity of the family. Because we, very, very unusually for a promoter family, had religiously paid off the workers' salaries, paid the bank loans installments every month. And as a family, we hadn't taken home salaries for 6 months. So when, after a few years, Vasant Rao decided to take a back seat, and Ashok, poor chap, was made the managing director. And that was probably the most miserable year of his life, because he was the kind of guy who's an inveterate. He's been called an engineer's engineer. So he's a great designer. And he didn't like anything that went with the role of MD. So what does he do? He goes to T. Thomas and says, why don't you make Hema the CEO? She's good with marketing. She's been selling her products in the field. And she's learned a little bit about electrical engineering in spite of a BCom background. And so that, in a nutshell, is how I came into the business. And Liftoff tells the story of the company Conzerv until we sold to Schneider in 2009. And what we do now is, Ashok and I do the usual things that most entrepreneurs who exit seem to do. We mentor, we do a little bit of coaching, we invest in social enterprises, and we try and help deserving nonprofits get to where they want to be. So coming to Nitin, your question, do you want me to answer that now, or should we allow Ashish to talk about himself a bit first?
Yeah, Ashish, yeah, why not? I think it's good. We can have a quick round of introduction.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Hema, and thanks, Nitin, for making this evening possible. And again, I'd like to reiterate our thanks to the entire Takshashila team for putting this together and for putting up with my technological challenges. Thank you again. I'm relieved to be on over here, and so far so good. So good evening, friends. I'm Ashish Sen, and at the moment I'm discovering the joys and pains of reliving my past thanks to the lockdown. I'm feeling 19 or 20 all over again, which is about 1/3 of my real age, and discovering the joys and pains of living in the kitchen, and also trying to figure out what to cook and not to cook, and also, working out what it is like to do, what is likely to happen when the dal you make is slightly burnt. So how do you make up for it with your significant other? Fortunately, Munira is not right here. She's in the other room listening to this, so she can't say anything. That is my wife. So apart from being a dal expert, which adds up to the spice in our lives at the moment, let me tell you a bit about myself. Born in Kolkata, it was called Calcutta then, in the late 50s. Grew up and did most of my education in Bombay, as it was known then, not Mumbai, in the 70s, and then completed my university education in the UK. I returned to India long ago in the 80s and started my career as a journalist with Business Standard, which was then under the editorship of the late Dr. D.K. Rangnekar. And it was during this time that I got more and more fascinated by the world of development. And then after Dr. Rangnekar passed away, I shifted my focus. And I was with ActionAid India in the 90s, looking after their communications. It was during this time that my interest in direct engagement with grassroots NGOs, communication-based NGOs, began to expand, and particularly community media. And in the early 2000s, I joined Voices and subsequently have been a part of the World Association of Community Radio Broadcasters, Asia Pacific region. I've been associated with the community radio movement since its inception in this country, and I'm now a communications teacher, writer, and a practitioner. I'm also an avid theater person, a theater practitioner. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm also an avid theater practitioner, and that is where I met my wife, Munira, on stage. We have one son, Mikhail, who now does more theater than both of us combined, and in fact spends his time when he is here instructing us how to step into each other's shoes without stepping onto them. It was in fact Munira who introduced me to Hema. And in our introduction, the word carrots played a key role. I'm not going to tell you very much more about carrots later, but it was and has been a life-changing experience. It was an introduction to the corporate sector and how. And I have actually, I believe, entered a new phase of my life as a result of this. I think thanks to my journeying Conzerv, I've discovered how important it is to blur distinctions between corporate and social sectors, and more than ever collaborate in an increasingly interdependent world. So that gives you a glimpse of who I am. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ashish. Hema, now let's get to this, right? I want to come back to that question which I asked you. What made you? You could have, enjoyed yourself doing whatever you were doing without having to bother with the enterprise of writing, 100,000 words or 200,000 words or how many ever words which the editors put on your head. So why? What was that? What was the main motivation?
Actually, the first person to tell me that I should tell my story and write a book was T. Thomas himself, and that was when my son was just 8 or 10 years old. So I'm talking about 15 years ago. And he said to me, your story is too good to remain untold. And when I started declaring in the family that this is what I'd been told and I was planning to sit down and write my story, Raghav looked at me and said, "Isn't that incredibly pompous, Amma? Why would you want to tell your own story?" And there was such disdain in his voice. And I think I was pretty affected by that. And I said, he's right. And I shelved that thought for a fairly long time until several years later, when I sold the business and, I was at a bit of a loose end. I was having lunch with Munira, Ashish's wife and a dear friend of mine for very, very long. And she said, Hema, it's an incredible pity that Conzerv's story and your story is being taught at HBS, Harvard Business School, and at Babson for so many years. And in India, hardly anybody knows you. That's a real shame. So I think that was another nudge that kind of pushed me over the edge. But finally, what really bit was this feeling that I'd had after I sold the business, that I really owed it to all the Conzervians who had been with us on that incredible journey to tell the world our story. It was a story that belonged to all of us. So I think that's when I really decided. I didn't know what I was letting myself in for, frankly, and I'll tell you a little later when we get to what it was like to write, that I really had, I think, bitten off more than I could chew. So yeah, that's it.
Okay, so I'll ask you to read something from your book first, but I just want to take this a little more on a personal side of things. What is it like to write a book about a family business? I mean, a family business itself is a very complicated kind of a setup. I mean, I've worked in Southeast Asia where there are Chinese family businesses which are extremely complex, and there are internal dynamics and vested interests within family groups. So to write about a family business itself is quite a challenge, isn't it?
It is indeed. And I think there were lots of tough bits in this whole journey of writing the book. But when you asked me that question, I think you forced me to introspect about which bit was the toughest. And I think indeed it was reliving the past and writing about what went on in the family business, and which led us down a certain path. And I think the reason it was tough was I had to be really careful to record or be true to facts and how things had actually happened versus my sometimes blurry memory of how I felt at the time. Because sometimes what you take away from a situation is an emotion. It's a feeling that gets lodged in your brain. So when you're writing, everything is in black and white. And I had to really be very careful that I was striking that balance. And I'm not sure. Maybe I've done a fair enough job because everybody's still talking to me. So, but that was a very tough kind of tightrope walk. And the other balancing act that I think I had to do was not being offensive versus glossing over or completely leaving out unpleasant things that I didn't want to deal with while writing. And Karthik Venkatesh, who I hope is on this call, my eagle-eyed editor from Westland, was very quick to catch those gaps, and he would annotate with his red track change pen. Hema, what happened here? What happened between this period and that period? You've missed that out. And I would just have to dig my heels in and grit my teeth and write about an uncomfortable part. And of course, I wasn't being nasty in my language, but it certainly took something out of me when I was doing it. So I was just thinking about it. It was tough enough living through some of those very early years of challenge and family conflict. But writing and rewriting it as part of the creative process was really like living it over and over again.
When you were writing it, comments from, is this echoing? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. When you were writing, did you get any pushback from family saying, why are you writing this? Isn't it better to keep some of these things private and so on?
I'm sure they thought it. I didn't hear it.
That's nice. That's a very, 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 very diplomatic family arrangement that you had. Okay, on that note, Hema, why don't you read a passage for us? And then we'll do this. We'll ask you to read, then we'll have a conversation, and then we'll get people to ask questions.
So a passage that I've chosen is from the chapter called More Than Just Money, which is a chapter I wrote to record that unlike a lot of experiences that companies and promoters have with their venture capital investors, my experience and Ashok's experience was just out of this world. We literally had angel investors and angel in character and angel in nature. And I thought it was very, very important for me as a person that I should record all my learnings, because there was so much that I learned from Mr. Thomas and my board. So I'm going to read a passage called, "You can either be a cook or a CEO." And Ashish has just talked a lot about cooking. So Ashish, you should listen to this. In my first few weeks as CEO, I was grappling with the challenge of letting go of my new mother-cum-housewife persona and donning a corporate head honcho role. I had no clue where to start. My son, my firstborn, was 15 months old. We lived in Yelahanka, which in 1996 was almost considered rural Bangalore, and therefore had limited access to nannies and trained help. And where was I to find a clean and reliable play school in the boonies? Thomas would call occasionally to check how the new arrangement was working out at the company. On one such call, I told him I wasn't giving enough time to the business because I had to handle chores at home, including cooking. "Get a cook," he said. "You can either cook or you can be a CEO." He then made a series of calls from his office in Nariman Point, Bombay, to the promoter CEOs of his other investee companies, all men, and asked them to help me find a cook, and fast. At the very first investee company dinner organized by Indus Venture in a beautiful setting in one of our city's finest heritage hotels, the first question I was asked after being introduced was, "So did you find a cook? Mr. Thomas has been following up with us." On a more serious note, his actions made me realize how much he wanted us to succeed and how far he was willing to go to support us, in spite of his awe-inspiring reputation as an industry legend. Some years later, almost unconsciously, I, in turn, did what I could do to support and empower women who were highly qualified and bright, but had gotten stuck in the stay-at-home rut with no opportunities to go out and show their talent. Thankfully, we've had great success stories with all these women. They've continued in the company after the acquisition by Schneider or moved to other international companies in high positions. Yeah.
That's fantastic, and it's very poignant and pertinent that you're mentioning it at this point, because all of us now, I suppose on this call, are making that trade-off between homework and housework and working from home. I was at a BIC panel a couple of days ago, and I said that, look, if companies are going to make working from home a part of our work life in the future, then they must ensure that they provide a dishwasher and a vacuum cleaner to everybody at home, right? And my particular wish list was also to have genetically engineered vegetables which are already chopped, so the onions and the tomatoes and everything don't have to be chopped, and we don't have to waste our time doing the low value add stuff. But yeah, that trade-off, I think, which you mentioned, is highly, I think we can all feel it. Those of us who are married, the men who are married will know that their wives are dealing with these, working wives are dealing with these challenges. And of course, the women on this will probably be able to tell us a lot more and at great length on the problem this is. And
Nitin,
one of the things.
sorry, can I just add something to what you said? You mind if I butt in?
Yeah, sure.
So, just adding to what you said, as an independent director on some boards, I realized that for me, it was such a difficult thing that I would go for a meeting in Bombay, wake up at 4 o'clock, make sure that Ananya's snack box, everything was organized. Not that Ashok was incompetent or incapable. I just felt it was my moral responsibility to take care of that end and then leave for the airport with enough time, for the flight, and then sit through a whole day's board meeting and come back and make sure that everything was ready for the next day. And now that we've gone through this COVID-related cooking, it would be very interesting to see the conversation between the other male independent directors. Maybe they discuss the quality of the sambar or ask each other where they bought their rasam powder. I'm just raring to go back into a boardroom after COVID. That's just on a lighter side.
Yeah, but I think it's sort of sensitized everybody to this big challenge of working from home versus doing housework. Everybody, male, female, children, adults, everybody seems to have to deal with this trade-off. And I hope some changes will occur, positive changes will occur after this. Ashish, let me bring you into this. How was it writing this? Hema was, of course, a participant in the story, and you were, in a way, a fly on the wall at some points, and a person reflecting, the life which, the intensity of the life which other people live. How was it personally to write a book like this?
Yeah, I think it's been an extraordinary learning experience. In some ways, as I said, quite like life-changing. And in some ways, I'm still having withdrawal symptoms. It's also brought a new meaning to what I understand is a shared experience, because it has been a shared experience in many ways. This is an analogy in the theater which I'm going to take. Shared experience for many theater practitioners refers to the shared parentage that a play has. And I think theater guru and well-known actor Ian McKellen put it best when he said, actually, a play has three parents. You have the playwright, who is the biological parent, and then you have the director, who actually moves the page to the stage, so converts the pages into a production. And that is also essentially the story. And he does that, or she does that, with the support of the entire production team, the actors, and so on and so forth. And then you have the third parent, which begins on the opening night, which is the actors, yeah. And then every performance breathes new life into this story. And that's what shared experience is all about. But working with Hema on this book brought a totally new dimension to this, because, as you said, I mean, she's not just a subject, Nitin, actually, she is also the key protagonist of this book. The book, in a sense, is about the Conzerv trajectory, but in lots of ways, it's also more than just the Conzerv trajectory. It's about leadership, and it's about leadership of the Hattangadys, Hema and Ashok Hattangady, before, during, and indeed beyond Conzerv. So it was integral to have Hema's pen in this book, and indeed it is the integral part of this book. And I have to admit that one of the reasons why I think it worked and played out well was because of Hema's generosity of spirit, and I think because of the structures put in place, which we tried to follow to the best of our abilities. When Hema first approached me to writing this book, which was about 3 years ago, she was very vocal that she did not want to write it. She said and felt it would undermine the credibility of the book, and therefore wanted a fly on the wall, so to speak, or an outsider to actually write it. But I think she also saw, as we discussed the book, the importance of her pen and her voice being a pivotal part of this. So how did we balance the credibility of the book, to use Hema's phrase, and the fact that we needed to have authenticity, and authenticity would only happen if Hema played the central role? I think the structure that we followed and what she put in place was interviews formed a large part of the research and the making of this book. And she gave me a free rein to conduct interviews. And I think we conducted more than 100 interviews with Conzervians. I say Conzervians because although technically speaking, they may be ex-Conzervians, it's been more than a decade since Conzerv was acquired by Schneider Electric, but you talk to any of them and they always refer to themselves very much as Conzervians. So Conzervians, industry leaders, policymakers, and their experiences form a pivotal part of this book. At the same time, you have Hema's pen written in the first person, writing the Conzerv trajectory, but also interweaving her own experiences before, during, and after.
Yeah. Ashish, can I stop you there and
Sure.
ask you to read something which you've written? Read out something which you particularly think was quite important.
Sure. So I think I'll go back to that C word which I started off with, carrots. Why carrots is so important. And I'll read you a bit from the preface, which I've written, because it also tells you why I got into the book and why I feel a book like this is important, and the Hema Hattangady story. So without more ado, mid-November 2015, my wife sent me a must-read email attachment. It was a short story titled Carrots, Fresh Carrots, and it was unputdownable. It was a first-person narrative about a day in the life of a vegetable vendor on a Bangalore street. As a development practitioner, I was struck by the author's insights into human behavior and a pen that almost instinctively understood the paradoxical divides that confront our society. As a theater person, I was impressed by the author's ability to get to the essence of human drama in less than 2 pages. The action, conflict, and resolution, or lack thereof, provided abundant food for thought. It not only revealed an ability to see both sides now, but also demonstrated a deep concern for community, and what development scholar Robert Chambers describes as putting the last first. In his seminal work on participatory development, Whose Reality Counts, Chambers has powerfully underscored that the poor need to be at the center and not at the periphery of development. Their voices must be taken into account in identifying, tackling, and resolving development issues. Carrots, Fresh Carrots, did just that. I didn't expect the writer to be Hema Hattangady. I had been introduced to her earlier by my wife as a successful corporate leader who had spearheaded the transformation of Conzerv systems in Bangalore from a small family business in 1996-97 to India's most successful energy management company until it was acquired by Schneider Electric India Limited in 2009. It was difficult for me to reconcile what seemed to be two seemingly contrasting images and words. On impulse, I contacted her and asked if she would lead a class of undergraduate students on theater and social development at Christ University in Bangalore. And she agreed. The session was electrifying. The feedback was beyond expectations. We had students writing back with alternative endings to carrots and others who wanted to be involved in Hema's work with less privileged communities. And that is how my journey into the world of Conzerv began. And during the course of my several interactions with Hema Hattangady, I learned about her training metaphor, the story of the starfish from the book Power of Vision by Joel Arthur Barker. I did not realize then how close to the bone it would prove to be. and it is a story worth retelling. A man was walking along the beach at sunset. He listened to the swish of the waves and the padding of his own feet, and then he noticed that the sand was littered with starfish. They lay there dying because they could not survive long out of the water. In the distance, the man saw a boy running frantically up and down the beach. As the man got closer, he saw that the boy was picking up the starfish and throwing them back into the sea. Again and again he ran. He picked up one or two of the stranded creatures and returned them to the water. The man asked him, "Little boy, what are you doing?" The boy replied, "Can't you see I'm saving the starfish?" "Don't be silly," said the man. "There are thousands and thousands of starfish. How can you possibly make a difference?" The boy hesitated for a minute, and then he said, he picked up a starfish, cast it back into the sea. Looking back at the man, he said, "Well, it made a huge difference to that one." And on 31st December 2016, the Starfish Story came to life quite uncannily. Walking across Talpona Beach in South Goa, savoring the last sunset of the year, my family and I were struck by the line of starfishes that dotted the sandy stretch. Almost involuntarily, I bent down and, one by one, began to cast them back into the sea. Bemused, my son and wife asked me what I was up to. I didn't need to complete my explanation before they joined me. The Conzerv culture had struck home. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashish. So that's nice. I think it's a nice segue into, let's get into the, the substance of business management and leadership, which comes into this. Hema, if I were to ask you to identify one or two frameworks which you've written about in the book, right? Explain to us, you don't have to act like be a theoretician about this. I mean, no one expects a theoretical abstraction about this. But if you were to take out the framework which you've designed, yeah, and explain to us how you put it into action, and that will be helpful. Now, it will be even more interesting if you could relate it to the challenges businesses are facing today, right? Especially in a deep supply and a demand shock as we are in today. Yeah. I mean, this is of course a huge challenge. I think the most highly paid minds in the country are still not able to come out with a satisfactory answer. So I think we shouldn't try to expect that to come out of this conversation. But if you were to use some of your frameworks, what would they be? How would you do that?
Yeah. So in the book, I've talked about 3 or 4. So I'm just going to tell you about my favorite one, which I think has turned out to be something that applies across sizes of companies and natures of companies, whether it's a non-profit or a large corporate, it's worked. And that's called the ELF matrix. It's really an HR tool. And I created it because I was inspired by Hema Ravichandar, who was the director of HR at Infosys many years ago. And she used to say that people come to work for yearning, learning, and earning. And Infosys policies under her had aimed at giving employees value addition on these 3 parameters of learning, earning, and emotional value add. So I decided to use those principles to find out what is it that employees really, what are they all about? What do they seek? And what do they think they get on each of those parameters on a scale of 1 to 10? So it was actually a very touchy-feely thing, but I tried to put a number to it in order to find out what made people really tick, and also to find out that inter se among these 3 parameters, which one mattered most to whom. Because remember that every company has a very specific culture, and every culture offers each of these 3 parameters in a certain ratio. So when I designed this tool, I found that it was very quick and easy to fill. So we started using it at the selection process in interviews. And we also found it was very easy to interpret. And that was because when a person, the candidate put down their scores, on 10, I get 7, I used to get 7 or 8. Yeah.
For those of us who have not seen the ELF framework, can you just explain what ELF is before you just jump on?
Yeah, so it's E stands for emotional, L is for learning, and F is for financial value add. The three, remember I talked about learning, earning, yearning. So I translated that into emotional value add, learning, and financial value add, which is what the acronym ELF is for. Sorry?
These are on a scale of 1 to 10.
Yeah, that's
Yes.
yeah. So I would ask people to rate what they wanted on each of these. So emotional value add, learning value add, and financial value add. What is it that they seek out of a company's culture, and what is it that they got in the company that they had just left? And by comparing those scores and by getting the candidate to talk about why they had put those down and what it was that they really wanted, I think you got a kind of line of sight into the psyche of the person, and then you made a judgment call about whether the culture that you offered in your company would fit the candidate or vice versa. So we started using this tool pretty effectively, actually, in not just at selection, but at several points along the employee's journey in the company. We didn't always get it right, obviously. This is not an exact science. But I think organizations, including yours, Nitin, have found that it can be quite useful in figuring out whom you don't want inside the company or who you really want to retain with a little bit of tweaking of personnel or HR policies. So that's one of the frameworks. And linking it to the current situation, I mean, that's it's a tough one to answer because I've got some stuff about what it is that businesses need to do at these times. And I thought I could go to that towards the end of this conversation.
Yeah.
But a tool like this would probably help people to figure out, leaders and managers, help them to figure out that when times are tough, capex is limited, cash is scarce and is all important. Who are the people who are going to stay with you in the long haul? Who are the people who are willing to make all the changes that will now have to be made? Because our lives have changed forever. Nothing can be taken for granted. I think the importance of fit with the culture of a company has become even more radically important than it ever was. So if ever there was a time for a tool like ELF, I think the time is now.
Yeah, we've the experiences we had, right? So what we do is we tried the ELF with our staff for 2 years now. And what I found very interesting is that it gives you a sort of a very interesting pulse of the career heartbeat of various members of the staff. You know, you find out that some people who you thought were really satisfied with the learning actually seem to want more. You know, you thought that this person, this particular person was very enthusiastic, very curious, very hardworking in terms of learning new things, and you thought that okay, this person probably is adequately supplied with learning. And when you look at the help, and this person seems to be the one who says, look, I still need to learn a lot more. And then you also have people who are not really learning much, but feel that the gap between what they expect and what they are currently doing is very narrow. It's not. So you actually can make very interesting judgments about not just people you're hiring, but how people are performing within the organizations. And to me, at least, it helped me diagnose in those three categories what are the expectations that as a small organization, we have about 30 people. As a small organization, we need to meet, right? And in what form? Because not everybody is looking for the same thing. And I've met many startup founders who seem to think that it's only about financial remuneration, right? Many of the experienced people, they're just coming in to get a financial remuneration. Or if they're hiring young people, they say, oh, this person just wants to put it on the CV, right? To understand that there are at least 3 dimensions, and you could appreciate, you can use them in some way is interesting. But I have a follow-on question, which is a little, let's say, it's a pushback. And I've felt this as an engineer working in public policy. I've felt this a lot of times. Are we trying to put numbers on something which is inherently subjective? Right? Even appraisals are like that, right? You have a wide variety of subjective factors stretched across a spectrum. But then we're trying to put them in grade 1 to, number 1 to number 5 or number 1 to number 10. Even if we ask them to rate themselves in number 1 to number 10, don't you think that this sort of force fits an enormous amount of differences and diversity into a small numerical scale?
I think the reason I came up with that was because without it, it was so difficult to figure out a way of measuring something as abstract and as subjective, as you said, about how people view. See, it's finally a question of people's perceptions. Uh, exactly the example that you gave, that you thought you were giving a lot of learning opportunities and somebody thought they were not getting it. So it's all a question of measuring, trying to measure perception. And I had begun to feel that it was very important to get some sort of sense of maybe order of magnitude of what is it this person is thinking about the culture that we offer, and what is it that he really wants. So like I said, it's not an exact science, but in the absence of anything, this proved to be a pretty good tool. And I think it's not a question of force fitting. What is very critical, Nitin, in the way we implement this tool is listening to the person as he explains his course. And by listening to what he is telling you, the justification or the rationale that he offers, therein lies the magic of figuring out whether he is a good fit or not. And remember, this is not the only tool that one would use to figure out whether you wanted him or her in your organization, or whether you wanted to confirm him or her at the end of probation. It would be one of several other things that you would do, and see whether they are all adding up to the same thing. So yeah, that's what it is.
Okay. Ashish, I just want to come in here and if you can take us on a slightly different note with one of your readings, that'll be good. So we could jump on to something else in the in the book, because if there are two of you, I can easily break the pace of this conversation with by alternately throwing the ball to you and to Hema.
Sure. So another reading, Nitin. Well, based on what I've heard over here and Hema talking about ELF, I think this really again underscores that we're dealing with a thought leader. So maybe something on thought leadership might be interesting at this point of time. So I'll quickly leaf through that chapter and and start. Yep. Thought leadership.
Yeah.
So thought leadership is increasingly emphasized today as a critical ingredient for success and sustainable growth. But what does thought leadership constitute? Who is a thought leader? Why is thought leadership important today? While I was mulling over these questions, I recollected a conversation that I had had several months earlier with the Hattangady's then 21-year-old son, Raghav. When I asked him about his impressions of Conzerv, he said that it would be a mistake to view it only through the lens of commerce. The image I have, and this is Raghav's quote, the image I have is of this weird, funky shaped thing being pushed into a very straight-laced box. And as Raghav was speaking, I was also reminded of what R.R. Nair had shared with me about Hema Hattangady's commitment to the well-being of her people, something which I believe is very important in the current context. And her emphasis on addressing, in quotes, employee satisfaction and employee engagement through processes like ELF. R.R. Nair had punctuated his point by affirming that these skills are not taught in business schools. Nevertheless, it reflected her thought leadership and her own flair to resolve difficult situations and her capacity to deal with challenges. To this day, two of Conzerv's initiatives, Conzerv My Campus, now called Conzerv My Planet under Schneider Foundation, and Alliance for an Energy Efficient Economy, AEEE, continue to flourish and grow. A third initiative, Conzervina, a women's network that started within Conzerv, lives on till today through the relationships it has fostered among its members. All three are diverse examples of Conzerv's legacy. While each has its own story, an underlying common thread knits them together. Each in its own right exemplifies the essence of Conzerv's thought leadership. These live on and grow which finally makes me ask this question: what lies at the roots of thought leadership? What is the ingredients that nurtures its potency? In their book, How Will You Measure Your Life, authors Clayton M. Christensen, James Allworth, and Karen Dillon offer a single word in answer. The word is purpose. Every company has a purpose. It rests in the priorities of the company and effectively shapes the rules by which managers and employees decide what is most important in each unique situation. If an organization has a clear and compelling purpose, its impact and legacy can be extraordinary. The purpose of the company will serve as a beacon, focusing attention on what really matters. Conzerv's thought leadership was driven and motivated by a single purpose: the well-being of people, community, and the environment. And that is why its legacy continues to endure. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashish. That was I'm so glad I've asked you to read it, because the theater personality shines through your reading. So it's wonderful having you read it. Hema, I think that's, if I were to segue from Ashish's reading into what you were just saying about thoughts in the current, for businesses in the current moment, what would they be? I think it's definitely a time for managers and leaderships in small, big, extra large companies to show thought leadership, right? And leadership in various ways, including in ways of thinking, because we've been presented with this unprecedented crisis. So better ways of thinking, more sensitive ways of dealing with the challenge, appropriate ways of dealing with the challenge given the Indian circumstances are all very important parts of the puzzle. So what would you have to say about that?
Okay, I'm not probably the world's best qualified person to talk about it, but given my experience in the world of business and the cycles of business that we saw, I can just share a few thoughts. So one of the first things that struck me when I was just pondering this was every one of us, whether we are small, large, medium business or an individual, we are going to rethink our daily lives, right? And how we run our businesses. And I think everything is going to center around something that we never used to think about very much before, and that's supply chains. I mean, today you and I are thinking about, or at least until last week, we were worried about whether we'll get bread for the day. There would be a WhatsApp drumbeat, like the Phantom comics. There would be the Dekali jungles drumbeat would go through from one WhatsApp group to another saying, there's drumsticks at my street corner, do you want them, kind of thing. And I think for businesses, what's going to happen is that they will start having to look for local supply chains. Suddenly, the world has shrunk and it's come into your neighborhood, and you now have to look around for where you can source everything that you need, which you had just succeeded in outsourcing in a very, very globalized world. So there is this huge paradigm shift in the way we're going to see our supply chains, and we don't have the time in which to do it. And the second thing I think that's going to happen is there's this massive geopolitical shifts that are going to happen in country relationships, right? I mean, there's a huge trust deficit with certain countries in the world for very obvious reasons. So businesses are going to have to start spotting opportunities. If I used to source something from country A and, our government is not very happy about dealing with it, now what am I going to do about that? And is there an opportunity for me to step up to the plate and offer my product where another country has left the spot wide open? So that's going to call for a radically agile thinking, and it's not going to be easy, obviously. I mean, just because you think there's an opportunity, you're not going to be able to jump in and supply the stuff, especially when your supply chains are constrained. So that's another challenge that people are going to face. And like I said earlier, when I was talking about ELF and relating it to the current situation, CapEx has become scarce, right? So if you divided it into what you should spend on in terms of vital, essential, and desirable, people are just going to say, what do I really, really need? That's the only CapEx. Governments and businesses are going to worry only about spending money on vital capital expenditure items. And cash is going to suddenly become the most important thing. So lots of things go out the window in terms of, you may have planned certain welfare schemes for your employees. Lots of CSR spending, for example, is the worst hit. In fact, just yesterday I was talking to someone who said with some authority that 60 to 70% of non-profits are going to go belly up in the next 6 months because CSR funding is going to suddenly be curtailed. And it's, when I say suddenly, it's just overnight. And the same story is about startups, people who just started up in the last 6 months to 1 year or 2 years, who had thought that sewn up their finances and sources of funding, suddenly find that money is drying up. So with money just getting sucked out of the system and this rapid reprioritizing that's happening, managers and leaders are really having their hands full. Basically, people will have to do more with less. And I think the toughest thing that's already affecting companies is if you don't have enough money, we've got to reduce our compensation. How companies are going to do that is going to amplify the culture that they've been nurturing. And yesterday I saw a communication that came on WhatsApp from the Reliance Industries board, which talked about how the chairman is foregoing his entire annual compensation, etc. So I think the critical thing in that situation is how is the leader going to set an example and make people in the company feel that by compensation reduction, they are going to be able to add some value, contribute to alleviating the situation that we are all in and not engender a revolt. That's going to be a very, very tricky situation. And especially in companies where this kind of culture doesn't exist, it's going to be very difficult. And I want to talk about Conzerv because on this note, because I remember we were going through a very, very bad quarter where cash was really tight. And I was at my wit's end because Ashok and I had our personal guarantees with the bank. And if we weren't able to collect our receivables, very soon this flat we lived in, theoretically, the bankers could just walk in and exercise their option to seize it. One of my regional managers in a very, very large and profitable region in India called me up and said, ma'am, we understand that business is really going through a tough time. I'm facing it, and I'm one of the reasons why cash is tight in my region. We're just not able to collect, but I want you to do one thing. I'm volunteering to give up 30% of my salary from this month until Conzerv's cash position improves. Fortunately, I discussed that with Mr. Thomas, and he said, you're going to do no such thing. It's very good of him to offer. But I think it signified what the culture was all about. People felt assimilated in the business and said, hey, if it was my family, this is what I would have voluntarily done. So I think one will have to wait and see how companies are going to handle this compensation bit because we've just come off a cycle where, bonuses were sky high and people expected the moon. So that's going to be a tough one to handle. So leaders will have to basically set an example. And, companies which are small and mid-sized, which form the core of our economy, which generate the jobs and the employment, if they are leveraged, and most of them are, they are going to really struggle. So I was listening to a very nice conversation with the chairman of the Murugappa group, where he said very wisely that this is the time for dialogue and for transparency. If bankers, their large customers and the suppliers and the mid-sized and small companies who are usually in the supply chain, if they don't sit down and talk about a situation or an arrangement where the big guys can help the small guys, the whole ecosystem is going to collapse. So we need a dialogue. And he said in his group, they've already started doing that. People are talking to each other. He's told his heads of businesses, go out and get these conversations going. That's going to be an unusual one because most companies usually look inward, but this is a time to look outward. And finally, I think empathy, Nitin, is going to become a critical value. Whether we are employers or philanthropists, I think it's no longer just about figuring out where you can do some good and give some money. More than ever, it's going to be about giving our time. It's about getting into under the skin of people, getting into their shoes and figuring out how can we help them to enhance the quality of their lives and retain their livelihoods. And at the moment, I don't see that happening, but this is the kind of language that we'll have to all start talking.
Thanks, Hema. The one hour mark in the conversation, and I have an iron rule which says at the 1 hour mark, we should get participants to jump in. So can I request people to raise hands? There's a little, there should be a little button to help you raise your hand, which we internally we joke as the Congress Party symbol. So there's a little hand that you could raise. We've also asked Zoom to create a lotus and a broom and various other party symbols also. But right now we've got to live with the Congress symbol. So those of you who would like to ask a question, do raise your hands and I'll come to you one by one. I'll request Apurv or one of the moderators to unmute the speakers. General Menon, I think you have a hand up. You get the first question.
Yeah, good evening, Emma, and congratulations. I have two questions for you. Actually, you managed this in an environment which is completely different from today, when the government, the license Raj was very much in effect. So tell us about that experience of yours. And secondly, about the banking institutions. How was that experience, you know, with the bankers? How were they at that time? So could you just tell us about how you...
Were the bankers nice then, or are they in the bank nice now? Is that the question?
So let me take your second question first. In fact, it was something that I'd wanted to talk about, but I think we are running out of time. So when I look back, General Menon, I realized that we did run the business in much gentler times, and banks were indeed in better shape. Basically, if we could prove the ability to pay and showed a willingness to pay and a track record, money was available. And also, I think it was very important that at the same time, we didn't have to worry that we would offend anybody if we expressed publicly our frank views on what the government did or didn't do. And we could just, you know, stand up on a soapbox and talk about what we felt about policies and what could have been done better. And banks indeed were fairly understanding. And I remember the public sector banks, in fact, the wisest advice I got from Mr. Thomas was that in those times, it made much more sense to go to the public sector banks. And we had a tough time with one of the private banks we had gone to. And when we switched to the State Bank of India, one thing we discovered is they believed that they were your business partner. It took a little bit of time for them to get used to you and us to get used to them. But once they discovered that you were good people and that your intent was genuine and you had a good business, they would really back you to the hilt. And I think I was one of the first few companies who managed to get out of personal guarantees at the bank, even though I was a small scale, an SME, because they realized that it just didn't make sense. You know, they're sitting with the title deeds to my property, and there's a lot of stuff going out there. We've got huge order books, etc. So they discovered it's better to get their act together and help me out every time I needed money, and that I was all about growing the business. So the relationship with the bank was very, very good. And I think banks were in better shape at the time. And your first question was about, yes, in the early days, I remember, in fact, in the book, I've written about trips to Delhi to do something called list attestation of my electronic components that we wanted to import, like chips, ICs from Texas Instruments or something. We couldn't import until I had filed an application. Then there was something called the Development Commissioner of the Small Scale Industries, DCSSI, and there would be a queue of people, etc. So it meant planning. We had to make sure that we met the right people. We had to be very clear that we didn't assume that there was going to be corruption just because somebody was in the government. And, you know, very often when you delegate things like this to somebody down the line and they come back and tell you, you know, ye nahi hone wala hai because this guy is corrupt, then that's when your antenna go up, because you can't start with the presumption that somebody is corrupt and therefore your clerk is taking much more time to get things done. So the experience was, I must say, very sobering, that there was so much planning that went into totally infructuous things. You know, we could have been doing so much more constructive stuff with our time, but that's what the environment was. And because we had a zero tolerance policy for bribery and corruption, it made our lives that much more difficult. But I think we learned a lot of lessons along the way about how we had to manage different kinds of people and situations. And yeah, you just get used to it, you know. And now I look at companies and realize just how many acts have been repealed, things are much easier, not quite as easy as they could have been, but certainly businesses are running today with a lot less to bother with government intervention.
Soumya, you had a question, right?
Yes. Hi, Hema. I really enjoyed reading the book. And my question is on page 30, I think there's an instance where you talk about the thing of somebody calling you a ladki, moving from a sales girl role into a CEO avatar, right? So I just wanted to check, during that phase, in your Conzerv journey itself, did you witness any sort of climb in workforce participation? Because I did read through the book that there were rare scenarios where you had women colleagues to interact. But if you can point out some incremental changes that you saw where women could participate better in an environment that you were in.
You mean at that time, at Conzerv?
Yes.
Yeah. Just rephrase. Are you asking me whether in Conzerv whether we had more women?
Yes, one is that. And did you see in that journey that there were incremental changes where women opted into careers like this, and in an industry where...
Not at all. In fact, we see a lot more women now. It's a pity that many of them are falling off the face of the workforce in large numbers. But there was a time I think when IT and BT started doing really well, and finance and HR became professions which became extremely attractive for women. We saw a steep climb in women in the workforce. Women on the shop floor, indeed, in the manufacturing industries, we found that we were one of the rarest examples that we brought women into the workforce as shop floor operators. And then there were associations or industry associations which tried to emulate what we had done. So we saw a lot of influx at that entry level and in the manufacturing, in the blue collar workforce. Unfortunately, at that time, in the middle and senior managerial levels, very, very few women were around. And you could have counted them on the fingers of one hand. It was tough times, and I think the kind of awareness that you have and the regulation that you have, that you must have, starting with women directors and the focus on gender diversity, that wasn't there at that time at all. So it depended on you as a leader. If you were aware enough and forward enough to think about issues like this, then you would do it. But I think we were more the exception than the rule, which is why this guy got away with that statement that tum to ladki thi, sales girl ladki thi aur tum CEO ban gayi ho. But today, I think people would think twice before using politically incorrect language like that.
Okay.
Yeah, one of the things we found when we were studying this issue of increasing employment and jobs in the country a couple of years ago, we started this study. What we found is that when a woman joins the workforce, she creates more than one additional job. Because when a woman joins the workforce, she might have to arrange for childcare, she might have to arrange for domestic help, she might have to have a driver or a security guard and so on. So there are a lot of other service jobs created in the economy when a woman joins the workforce. But when a man joins the workforce, he just creates his own job, in the sense that, there is. So it also tells you, I think, it's a statement of the kind of workload women bear in society, especially Indian society. But from a very economic perspective, it is in the absolute national interest to get more women into the workforce. And we've got all sorts of excuses and arguments why that is not possible, right? All the way from social arguments, which says, it's better for our women to stay at home and look after children. Or people say, there are no street lights in the city. So if there are no street lights, how will women find it safe to come back home? There are no footpaths. Public transport is crowded. As if these constraints like footpaths and public transport and street lights are binding constraints. The argument should be, go and fix the street lights, go and fix the buses, go and fix the sidewalks. They're not like hard laws of physics that are constraining you. But I think the point in general is very important, that getting women back in the workforce now more than ever. Now it's going to be harder because every time there's a shock, it is going to be discriminating against women, right? So when you have to sack a person, they would rather sack a woman than a man. when they would hire a person, they would prefer to hire men than women. This is the reality of the political economy that we are in. But in spite of that, what I want to underline in this conversation is that it is in the national interest for more women to go out and work. It's at all levels, in rural areas, in urban areas, in all kinds of jobs. The more women we have in the workforce, the better it is for the country. And it creates more jobs for women and for men, right? So those curmudgeonly chauvinists sitting out there should remember that it also creates jobs for men and women. So that's
and
something
quite
which
apart from the quite apart from all the research and data that shows the increase in GDP that happens when women come into the workforce, right? At a national level, there's studies to show how there was a huge delta. I don't know which countries they talk about.
I know it's simple mathematics, right? Because if a mother stays at home and looks after her children, the value of those services is not captured by GDP. But if she employs childcare or a tuition teacher, and you actually make a financial payment to that teacher, that's captured in GDP, right? So you bring these uncalculated transactions into calculation. I mean, it doesn't mean that we've become wealthier because we've got bigger GDP, but at least the bigger GDP sort of gives you a better, accurate estimate of the size of your economy and the output that you're producing. While others are thinking of questions and raising their hands, I think I must bring Ashish back or Hema back, either one of you, to read something else. Either one of you. I mean, you choose. Or it could be both of you.
Can I read the ethics in business?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Hema.
Nitin, there are a few questions.
Okay, let's go with the questions.
No, can I ask Hema to finish this ethics thing and then go to the questions?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm going to read from the chapter Ethics in Business. It's one of my favorites because it almost didn't make it to the book. I didn't want to put in a chapter which sounded preachy, so I had to figure out a way of doing it. And the Babson professor who used to teach my case told me, you can't have this book if this chapter is not there. So that's the background story. I'm going to read a passage called Fire Them All. In 1998, I was traveling with our local area manager on a visit to meet customers in a state in Western India. On a busy day during our visit, he said, I need to tell you something. While you make these grand plans to quadruple the business and talk about integrity, the man you trust to lead national sales is corrupt. Following his lead, the 3 regional managers are also taking kickbacks from distributors in return for routing customer orders through them. A couple of calls to a few area managers in other regions confirmed that this allegation was true. It felt like I was the only one who hadn't known what was going on. I sat in stunned silence. The thought of what do I do now made me go numb as I struggled to come up with a response. I went through the day like an automaton, and after the last sales visit, I called TT in Bombay and poured out my anguish. He said, don't worry, this happens. Come and see me before you fly back to Bangalore. We will deal with this. I landed in Mumbai and went straight to his house. It was late in the evening. He was seated in his armchair with a writing pad and pen waiting for me. As soon as I caught my breath, he took me through the list he had made. First, if you're sure this is true, travel to each region and fire all the managers involved immediately. Second, meet all the distributors implicated and tell them what we've done and why. If they're defensive, fire them too. Third, tell everyone in the company. By the time he finished, I was in a panic. Fire all of them? How do I replace 4 sales heads and key distributors? What would the juniors who are loyal to them do? What would happen to the 3-year plan and the profitability that I had strived so hard to achieve? The questions were just endless. He said, what will happen to the company if you don't fire them? Nothing that followed was easy, but it had to be done. And it was. It was only much later that I realized how fortunate I was to have had that instantaneous and wise decision maker and the unflinching backing. We filled the positions over a year by elevating several junior managers and hiring new staff. It was disappointing to see so many young area managers leave with their bosses. But in my view, that's what helped the company.
Thanks, Hema. So I think I remember talking to you about this also, that when you have to let people go or you have to fire people for breach of ethics, you've got to make a lot of noise about it, right? So you've got to signal to everyone that the reason you're sacking this person is because of a breach of ethics. And
Yeah.
it's not something you want to hush up, because the tendency is to be, to
Yeah.
hush things up and let people go quietly. But your advice to people is to make a lot of noise about it when this happens, right?
It's called the deterrent policy.
Yeah, deterrent policy. I've got Dr. Kanchan who has a question, and if she can be unmuted, she can ask the question. Yeah, Dr. Kanchan.
Yeah, in fact, yes, before Hema read the chapter on business ethics, that's the question I was actually going to ask. So, yeah, the book has a chapter on, running an ethical business, and usually ethical business is considered an oxymoron, right? So what's really in the chapter is what was of my interest, and how did you manage to do that, in Conzerv? So that's one question. And my other question was to Ashish, in fact. Yeah, Ashish talked when he was, giving an introduction about how the social and the social sector and the corporates could work together, the social entrepreneurship kind of model. So I wanted him to, address how the book looks at, how the social gels with the profit-making, motive. So how does the book reflect on that? So one for Hema and the other for Ashish, and thank you. It's been an engaging discussion so far.
Thank you. Dr. Kanchan, I think since I read this passage, it sort of gives you an insight into the way we sort of executed on this policy of zero tolerance to bribery and corruption. We had to lead from the front. We had to set an example. We had to say no to orders if there were kickbacks involved, which meant that we had to be ready to take a slightly lower achievement in sales. And that's not easy. And the reason we were able to do that was because our investors were backing us, and they said, listen, it's okay if you come back and tell us that this quarter you weren't able to meet the targets because there was a particularly corrupt customer that you didn't want to deal with. So it was also very important for us to figure out not to get trapped by some salespeople could have come back to us and said, you know what, I tried and I tried, but this guy was so corrupt, I couldn't sell. So we would then have to dig deeper and find out and make sure that indeed that was the truth. And the other thing that we found was, people generally want to work in a clean culture, and if you keep sharing stories about how you've kept the culture clean, you have to do a lot of storytelling. People then realize that there is an alignment between their personal values and the values in the business. And then it becomes a kind of a virtuous cycle. So that's one of the ways in which we try to drive an ethical culture. Ashish?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Hema. And thank you, Kanchan, for that question, for raising that question. I think, we've talked briefly about the fact that the Hattangadys were fundamentally concerned about the well-being of their employees. And this actually triggered this sense of community well-being triggered community ownership. Dr. Kanchan, you and I come from a community media space. So you would understand that for us, especially in community radio, there are 4 key characteristics that we talk of when we think in terms of community well-being. And that is sensitization of the community, participation of the community, community management, and community ownership. How did the Hattangadys manage to bridge this? I think we talked about Conzerv. If we go to the chapter beyond Conzerv, Nitin said I could read a little excerpt, and I think that actually gives you the fit. There is a chapter there called Beyond Conzerv, and I'd just like you to listen to this. And I think it will give you a sense of what I'm talking about. At the heart of the Hattangadys' wisdom is an ancient African word, Ubuntu, which roughly translates to a quality that includes essential human virtues, compassion, and humanity. The word has its roots in humanist African philosophy, where the idea of community is of the building blocks of society, a community which is based on the principle of I am because you are. Through all the experiences at Conzerv and beyond, Hema says, we learned a key life lesson. The most valuable thing is the worth of people. In the long run, it pays in always to look at the worth of people rather than the cost. Many Conzervians would echo Ashok Hattangady's view that one of the key reasons why Conzerv grew rapidly in revenue, profits, and stature was its success in building to borrow a phrase from proud Conzervian Gautam Jindal, a community called Conzerv. I think this is actually not so different from what we actually see in the social sector when we talk of community in, community well-being and community ownership. I think today, if you look at the work of the Hattangadys, I'll read another chapter, another excerpt. Hema loved the idea of working on a large scale in a neighboring community and the idea of a finite exit plan to avoid unhealthy dependencies. She wrote to the heads of 3 nonprofits, Ashwini Charitable Trust, Makala Jagriti, and Concerns Universe Foundation, all of whom were engaged in community work in the neighboring slum of MV Gardens in Bangalore, and asked if they could consider working towards a common vision for the slum by joining forces, sharing learnings, and coordinating towards achieving common goals. For years and years, I had written checks to these organizations for educating children or for sponsoring other needs. I yearned to go beyond checkbook giving and engaging in a more meaningful way until the community needed us no more. The seeds of community ownership.
Thanks, Shashi. See, I think one of the things I want to bring out in this is this whole idea of social enterprise. We've had these conversations many times in Takshashila, and there is, I could say that there are a variety of views on this in our organization. But where I come from is that I think every honestly run, legally run, sustainable and thoughtfully run corporation is a social enterprise. And Infosys, for example, is a social enterprise. It's created tremendous amount of wealth and livelihood, and maybe put even Bangalore on the map, on a global map, and created national value, right? So when an enterprise is run in a legal, ethical, and sustainable manner, it creates value for society. You don't necessarily have to create a new category of companies called social enterprises and put them on a different moral plane. I think a private company which generates profits for its shareholders and incomes for its people and creates valuable products for its customers is playing a very important social role. We should not, demean them and put them on a smaller moral plane. In fact, the wealth that is created from such enterprises can then be used for other non-profit and charitable and philanthropic work, right? So in a sense that I just get very uncomfortable when people say social enterprises or NGOs, you are a higher moral plane, and you profit-making enterprises, you're on a lower moral plane. I don't think so, because as long as you're operating in an ethical fashion and following the laws of the land, the morality of these are almost, but they play various different roles in society, generating value and then distributing, redistributing wealth. These are 2 different functions, but both functions are as important and morally as important to Indian society as ever. Don't discount the profit motive, right? And especially at these times when India has to grow itself out of this crisis, every entrepreneur, every innovator, every private business which creates value for society, creates employment and livelihoods, must be celebrated rather than looked down upon. And I think this should inform public policy as well. Are there any more questions? I sometimes look at we use Zoom for our teaching as well. And I have the habit of looking at who are the participants and asking them to ask questions. I say, hey, what do you think? But this is clearly not a classroom. So I'm going to refrain from that. So I'll leave it, let people volunteer. If they don't volunteer, if there are no further questions, I have a couple of questions to ask, but let me just give a couple of seconds for people to, yeah, you have Apurva Agarwal.
Yeah, hi. I have a question which is more to do around the culture and how do you actually build a culture that where people have high standards and are self-motivated to achieve. And I think this is something that I've seen with startups I interact with today, where the core team is very on board with the vision and is completely aligned with how to move forward. But as new people join the company, that culture just keeps getting diluted. Until then, you have like different people running in different directions. So what was that like? Because I know that Conzerv grew from a very small team to a very large organization. So what were some of the ways that you maintained that, or some advice that you would have for people working with startups today?
I note that we have less than 4 minutes left. So Apurva, what I'm going to ask you to do is, I have a whole chapter on culture in the book, and there are lots of things that one had to do to make sure that it wasn't only centric to the core team, but we had to make sure that everybody who came into the organization started getting infected and with the culture and the set of values that we had created, and also assimilated very quickly into the business. A whole bunch of tools that we use, but I'm going to share one quick one with you. And I discovered that on the very first day when an employee joins the company and sits in that induction program, that's the day when you've got to hook him and make sure that he understands what this company is all about. And he has to make sure, I mean, we have to make sure that he sees all of us at the top and the middle are aligned in the way we talk about things and the way we feel things. And the storytelling that we did on the first 2 days of induction is, I think, where we really got under the skin of these youngsters. And they in turn would go home and talk to their families about what had happened. So we did something very unusual. We would take them on day one to our CSR, the orphanages that we supported, the initiatives that we had. Very unusual, because on day one, you normally talk about finance and this is how we do our, manufacturing and all that. We'd allow them to spend as much time as they liked. And they'd come back asking, hey, some choti company hai, but why is it that they're spending so much time in the community? And when they got a chance to ask these questions to people who had worked with Conzerv for some length of time, they realized that it wasn't just an artificial layer. We weren't just talking. People were walking the talk. So that was just one of the tools that we used to integrate people into the culture of the company. There are a number of things that we did. We don't have enough time to go through all that, but you've raised a very important point. A lot of companies kind of fade away and disappear because it's only the promoters who have a dream about a culture and are not able to hang on to it as the company grows in size.
Thank you. I think it's time for us to bring this to a close. I have a little interesting announcement at the very end, but can I ask both of you to give your sort of closing comments, starting with Ashish and then Hema. 1 or 2 minutes to sort of close the bracket which we started with this conversation.
Ashish, why don't you go first?
Ashish, go first. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, thank you for inviting me to this fascinating discussion. I think it's been a learning experience for me. If I was to say in one word what it's really underscored, we didn't really talk about this enough perhaps, was that this is the importance of community and community well-being. And I think one of the points that Hema touched upon is empathy. And I think increasingly, we need to now, we're living in this world which is during COVID, post-COVID. I think we need to look at how corporates, social sector, government can be more empathetic in dealing with the community and with each other. That is how we will go forward. I think that is where the healing process will begin. So that really, in a nutshell, is my concluding comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashish.
Thanks, Ashish. Nitin, I just want to say a big thank you to you and Takshashila for two things. One is that throughout this book writing process, you were very key in egging me on. There were times when you'd say, hey, listen, you sounded excited, more excited a month or so ago, and now it's sounding like you're off it. So don't do that, because I remember you told me you had 4 books in work in progress, and that it's very, very easy to just give up. Thank you for that continuous questioning and kind of making me feel accountable to you to have finished the book. I feel a tremendous sense of relief that I've done it. I feel a sense of gratitude, actually, because of all the things that have happened in my life that enabled me to have this story and to tell it. And I also want to say thank you to all of you at Takshashila for doing what you do. I think your logo is this beacon, right? And I think you really breathe, live, think, talk, and act like a beacon to society. And may your tribe increase. And thank you very much to everybody for giving up everything else you could have done in the last hour and a half and for listening to us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have two announcements.
Really, thank you.
I have two announcements to make. The first announcement is that, Takshashila runs a technology and policy program, which is a 12-week completely online program for people in the business space, in technology, widely defined technology, science, etc. We have a graduate certificate in public policy program, one of which, specializations of which is technology and policy. I think it's very relevant to the people who have attended this conversation. Please look at our website and sign up for the current batch. The intake sort of ends today or tomorrow, but I think you can still go to the website and apply. It is entirely online. In 12 weeks, you'll get a very, very good handle on the practicality of how to deal with this. Some of Hema's work is part of the curriculum. Some of the cases will be talked about in some detail in the curriculum, but there are a lot of other things. So if you're broadly in the tech space, if you're broadly in the entrepreneurial or the business space, and you want to get a handle on how to deal with the public space, especially in these challenging times, I urge you to go and look at our website and sign up for the course. And because it's entirely online, you will save a lot of travel expenses also. So go and take a look. And the second is because you've been such a wonderful audience. If you had come to our office for this book launch, you would have, we had a book, copy of the book to give to you. We are giving the copy of the book to every single student which we have. So, yeah, I think you could hold it up, Ashish, if you have. I wish I could hold mine, but here's what it is. But what we're going to do is we're going to do the next best thing. Once the lockdown ends and we are able to get back to normal and people can move around, you're welcome to come to our office and pick up a copy of this book, right? So we have the list of people who attended, participated in this webinar, and you're most welcome to come to our office and pick a copy of the book anytime once this whole restriction on movement ends. So we would have loved to do this for you in our office, but there's no way I can send you a book through Zoom, right? And an ebook is not exactly a physical book. I really want to give
download it on Kindle.
Yeah, but that's not the same,
Yeah.
I want you to take the physical book as a token of joining us for this wonderful conversation. So please do come to Takshashila and pick it up when the coast is clear. So in the meantime, all of you stay safe, wear your masks, practice social distancing, wash your hands as many times as possible, and generally stay safe, be prudent. We're going to ride out this storm, and there is going to be a dawn at the end of this storm. Mixing of metaphors is intended, but yeah, there's going to be a dawn at the end of this storm. So we are all waiting for that dawn. But in the meantime, keep calm and carry on, and enjoy yourselves. Stay healthy in body, spirit, and mind. On that note, thank you very much. Thank you all for it.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Nitin. Thank you, Takshashila. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Cheers, everybody.
Thank you
and
so
for
much.
putting up with all my technological challenges also. Thank you again.
Nitin, I can finally see you.